Welcome or welcome back to Detailed, an original podcast by ArtCat. This is a show where we uncover lessons learned to help you navigate your next project. I'm Cherise Lakeside, Senior Spec Writer at RDH Building Science, and your host. My guest today is Darin Johnstone, Principal from Darin Johnstone Architects in Los Angeles, California. Darin is an award-winning Los Angeles-based architect and educator at SciArc Institute of Architecture. With 30 years of experience in the field of architecture and 25 years spent educating young architects, Johnstone offers a unique perspective at the nexus between practice and academia. In 2004, he founded Darin Johnstone Architects, or DJA. Just 2 years later, LA Architect named the firm one of the 10 to watch in Los Angeles, and in 2021, Arkello named DJA one of the top 25 architecture firms in Los Angeles. DJA is known for work that spans genres from architecture, urban planning and landscape design, to interior design, furniture design, and site-specific installation. In the past 10 years, DJA has designed and completed multiple award-winning renovation projects and comprehensive planning work for both ArtCenter College of Design campuses in Pasadena. In 2017, DJA completed a master plan for the SciArc campus in the Arts District of downtown Los Angeles. Recent projects include the ArtCenter Peter and Merle Mullin Gallery, the Bruce Heaven and Linda Weinman Alumni Gallery, and the Amundsen Auditorium. The project we're talking about today is the ArtCenter Mullin Transportation Design Center in Pasadena, California. The Mullin Transportation Design Center at ArtCenter College of Design is a masterful transformation of history into innovation. Once, and listen close, once a supersonic wind tunnel designed to test objects fixed in space, the structure has been revitalized into a state-of-the-art facility that invites motion, creativity, and experimentation, utilizing a building-in-a-building concept. Located within ArtCenter's South Campus in Pasadena, this adaptive reuse project redefines the boundaries of design education. Now, let's get into the details. Welcome or welcome back to Detailed. My guest today is Darin Johnstone, principal from Darin Johnstone Architects in Los Angeles, California. The very cool project we are talking about today is the ArtCenter Mullin Transportation Design Center in Pasadena, California. Darin, welcome to Detailed. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Cherise.
How are you?
Thanks for having me. I'm doing well. How are you?
I'm good. I'm good. Life is quieting down a little bit with all my crazy activities like this podcast. You need that downtime on occasion.
Yeah, for sure.
Holidays, pending holidays, typically give you that. So I usually start this podcast with an icebreaker question. And so I had a very good reason for picking this one for you today. Because it sounds like you've done a lot of teaching at SciArc.
I have.
Over the years.
Sure have.
I also do a lot of teaching and mentoring. So I would like to know, what are the top 3 pieces of advice that you give to your students in architecture?
Yeah. Oh, thanks for asking that. It's an interesting question, and I guess it depends on the level of the student, like where they're at, kind of meeting them where they're at in terms of delivering advice. But what I would say, kind of more generally, the first thing I always tell students is to work in studio, and I think it's so important because I know for me, I learned much more from my peers than I did from any one instructor at any given point in my career, and that the kind of bond that happens when you're all working on the same endeavor, with the same deadlines weekends, sharing meals, staying up late. Like that studio culture is really what arts and design education is about, and it's really a valuable part of the SciArc experience. And so I really tell students like that they should work in studio. Um, the other thing I tell them is that architecture is a very big umbrella. Which means that the endeavor of architecture and understanding like how we think and put things into the world, sometimes transcends the profession and even the discipline. And so you're not bound by the terms necessarily of those things because it is so broad. I mean, we used to say, architecture is the mother of all disciplines was a thing that we would say. And I believe I believe that's true. The other thing is, so just to kind of do a little rip off, I say make mistakes faster, which is me quoting Bruce Mao, quoting Andy Grove, which just means that when you're designing something, it takes a lot of iterations, and especially perhaps architecture. And so you really need to make a lot of iterations to get to a place of a kind of working concept or idea. And then you have to make many iterations to develop it. And so I think you have to be on board with that idea that in a way any given project is never really done. And I tell them even in my practice, like the evolution from schematic design all the way through to construction, the project is evolving kind of as it comes to life. So yeah, maybe those are three things.
I like that. I can relate to the last one. One of my favorite pieces of advice to students is never let fear stand in your way.
Yeah. Oh, that's
Because
nice.
usually it's some level of fear,
Yeah.
not like scary monsters fear, but some
Hmm.
level of fear that stops you from getting outside your box
Yeah.
or failing up,
Yeah.
or
Yeah. Yeah. For
trying a
sure.
different design or
Yeah.
whatever it is. Some level of fear is stopping you from doing that. Somebody's going to think I'm stupid, or, you know, what if that doesn't look good? And it took me a long time in my life to learn that.
Yeah.
Now nothing
Right.
stands in my way, but it took me
Yeah.
a really long time in my life
Yeah.
to learn that. But my world opened up so much once if nobody's going to die, why not? I mean, really, if it's not going to hurt anybody and, there's not going to be massive injuries or whatever, you really don't have anything to lose and you might have
It's
everything to
so
gain.
true. Yeah. It's
Yeah,
so true.
I
Yeah.
love
So
that.
true. Yeah.
So let's talk about this project. I'm really
Okay.
excited. I'm
Sounds good.
excited. So this project is unique, really unique. So basically, you took the ArtCenter College of Design's historic wind tunnel, which just blows my mind, by the way, and transformed it into the state of the art Mullin Transportation Center, or
Yeah.
MTDC.
Right.
Um, let's begin with the wind tunnel.
Sure.
Give me a little history on this wind tunnel and what you had to
Yeah.
work with.
Yeah, for sure. So, let's see. So rewind the tape. Let's go back to early 1940. So 1942, 1943. This facility was constructed to house a supersonic wind tunnel. I guess one of the biggest and one of the first in the nation. And it was owned and operated by Caltech. And so it was this kind of cooperative wind tunnel. And so, like, Convair, Douglas, Lockheed Martin, all these aircraft companies use the facility to test the aerodynamics of their products. So both commercial and military products were tested in this. And so you have to imagine that the space that we ended up working in was just filled with this giant machine. And then, in the middle of the machine, there was this transonic cart where they would put the models in to kind of test them. So let's say that's the origin story of the wind tunnel space. It was decommissioned, I think, in the early 60s, and then it was taken over by Decor Appliance Company. Decor Appliance Company used the kind of wind tunnel space where the machine used to be as their main factory floor, and then they constructed kind of support buildings around it. So now that 950, Raymond building is actually a collection of buildings, around this kind of key piece, which is the wind tunnel space. And so, yeah, so our project, Mullin Transportation Design Center, MTDC, sits within that wind tunnel space. So 85 feet wide by 220 feet long by 45 feet tall. So this giant volume with this big, beautiful kind of bowstring truss roof. That was the what we had to start with. That was our kind of starting point.
So before we start getting into some of those details, tell me exactly what is a transportation design center and what kind
Yeah,
of students will it serve?
yeah. So great question. So the I don't know if you know, but like Art Center is very well known for its transportation design department. It's one of the first and one of the most well known transportation design departments in the world, basically. And so I don't know, like the things like the Corvette split window, the current Mini, the Ferrari F430, and then all the concept cars that you see. It was like so many, all these things designed by Art Center alumni. So this is a very famous program, the transportation design program. And the transportation design program was initially housed in the iconic Craig Elwood building at the Hillside campus of Arts. I don't know if you know the building, beautiful building. But in that building, the students were really only able to engage with kind of fifth scale models and modes of representation, and very, very, very rarely or infrequently kind of full scale vehicular assets. And so this new Mullin Transportation Design Center, I think the key concept was to create a place for students to, engage with full scale vehicular assets while at the same time kind of cutting edge technology, in support of what is already an incredibly, successful curriculum.
So is it my first rabbit hole already? Is it all
Uh-huh.
about is it all about just cars?
No, so that's such a great question. I'm so glad you asked it, and I know that the folks at Art Center will be really happy that you asked it. So, our relationship to transportation is really changing, and what that means in the future is really changing and is really in part unknown. And so I think at the time that we were working with both the undergraduate program, which is maybe more kind of vehicular oriented, we're also working with the graduate transportation design program, which was thinking more on the scale of urban transportation systems and things at that other scale. And so it's definitely not only about cars, and the future of transportation, of course, we know cannot only be about cars, but also I think it's important to understand, and we can understand more as we get into the program of the project, but that it really is a kind of it's a hub or a node within the South Campus that really is for the Art Center population at large as well. So there's flex lecture space, which is part of the program, and there's a large portion of the program is just open to the general Art Center public to kind of see everything. And so I think it's really, initially it was conceived for transportation design, but I think it's understood now as a place for the entire school and for transdisciplinary thought and interaction. So that's a good rabbit hole.
Yeah. Let's hope they're all good rabbit holes. Well, I just think about it. I mean, people get around a lot of different ways now. I
They
mean,
do.
I live in Oregon
Yeah.
and there's electric bikes and these
Yep.
those, in my opinion, very annoying electric scooters that people ride on the sidewalks and leave laying around everywhere.
Yeah.
But there's all these different ways
That's
besides
right.
just cars and,
That's
airplanes,
right.
all different kinds of flight and driverless cars now.
Yeah. Yeah.
Which I will never get in a driverless car. I don't think I could ever trust that.
I did.
Um,
I have done it. It goes from eerie. It goes from incredibly spooky to incredibly normal in a very short period of time, I have to say.
re-
Yeah. Yeah.
really, and it
Hmm.
didn't. I'm driving with a human in the car, and if I'm not the one driving, I'm putting the brake on. I
Yeah.
think I've got a little bit too much of the control freak gene in me to
Yeah.
trust that, but
Yeah.
it seems to me that it would be terrifying.
Yeah.
But you
It
lived
was
through it, so
it was a very careful driver. Yeah.
I-
Much
yeah,
more
I
careful than
bet.
the average Uber driver.
Well, oh, I've got some horror stories about Uber drivers. So, okay, so maybe I'll try it in a parking lot or something sometime. So, it would seem to me this very unique space and this very forward thinking program that there was probably some, and old space, you know, starting in the 40s, it
Yeah.
seemed that there needed to be some probably pretty extensive programming involved in this
Mhm.
project.
Yeah.
So tell me a little bit about what that process looked like and the
Yeah.
resulting goals that you came up with
Mhm.
um, after
Yeah.
finishing that process.
Yeah. No, thank you. It's boy, this question could take a long time to answer because the reality is that, oh, sorry, my chair is hitting the table and causing noises. But the reality is that we did the project for our first project for Art Center was the 870 Raymond building, which is to the north of the wind tunnel building, and it was a renovation of a decommissioned post office and sorting facility that we turned into a home for fine art, the fine art and illustration department, and that kind of started our journey, our kind of 10-year, our 11-year journey with Art Center, and so not too long after that project, we started to work with them on something we called program mapping, which at the time Michael Maltzin was doing the master plan for the two campuses. So the 15-year vision, overarching vision for the kind of school as a whole. But the college needed someone to help them understand like where did all the parts and pieces need to land, in those interim years. So 5-year plans is what we worked on. And so we got to meet all the faculty and engage with them, understand what their needs were. And then, some programs were growing and things were changing. And so as we began to kind of do an assessment of the spaces and understand the needs of the different departments, which took, quite a long time, eventually in collaboration with Art Center, we came upon the idea of moving transportation design department from the Elwood building to the wind tunnel. And the fit made a lot of sense because it meant like they could return to engaging with full scale vehicular assets. There are these huge doors and large spaces, and a lot of things made sense in that regard. But then also the wind tunnel at the time, obviously only one level, so 16,000 square feet with this huge volume, was just technically just an underutilized space that they had. And so that was the kind of genesis of the project. And then, so once that took root and it turned into a real project, then we started working in detail with the chairs of the departments. Um, uh, I guess I should give them a shout out, right? I mean, there's Stuart Reed, Jeff Wardle, and then Jay Sanders were the people that we worked with for 5 years basically to understand the needs of the project. So they came with a pretty detailed program that was linked to their pedagogical goals. And then it evolved as we began to understand it through the lens of the wind tunnel and through the lens of budget and process and stuff like that. But I think, ultimately the goal was again it's interesting. I think the way that I describe it when I lecture is that there was a desire to be able to recapture something from the past, which was this engagement with the full scale vehicle, but then also a desire to project into the future and really understand like, oh, how do we engage with cutting edge technology and begin to imagine what the future of transportation might be like? Kind of linking back to that question you're asking about, is it just about cars?
So when you were done with that process, what was the resulting spaces you were going to design into this space?
Yeah, so I mean, the laundry list of things that we started with are the things that we finished with. They just kind of evolved over time. So there are um, open studio spaces for the graduate program on the upper level. There's a core of office spaces. And then all along the lower level, there are studio spaces, all kind of laminated to the east side. And then kind of floating in the middle, there's the um, undergraduate studio space. There's the flex lecture space. And I'll come back to that. And then all along in the kind of middle of the diagram, the area we call the street, there are the labs. So art and process lab, vehicle architecture lab, and then the fabrication lab. And so that laundry list never really changed. The one thing that was different from where we started is this idea of the flex lecture space, which was really the kind of brainchild of the administration. And I think that actually the president at the time had the idea of putting a space in the inside the wind tunnel that's for everyone to kind of send a message that, hey, this is about the school as a whole, not just about a single department. So, and it's used in that way. So I think, yeah, that about covers it. And it's interesting because just like anything, the program, evolved over time. So even though the laundry list is the same, the program evolved through all the phases of design, and even refinements again happening during construction. So
It's funny with the flex. I've done a number of interviews about university projects, and I'm seeing more and more of this, not isolating students in that are pursuing a particular degree from other students that are, and having more of these spaces where everybody
yeah,
comes together regardless of your major or what you're studying,
definitely.
because they're finding again that there's growth that happens with that,
Yeah,
and ideas being shared, and what are you doing, and
totally.
and
Hmm.
so I love that you have
Yeah,
that piece in there, because this is really a specialty program,
yeah.
really
It is. No,
specialty.
it
This
is.
isn't
Yeah, it's really
accounting.
it's built to suit. No, it's really
Yeah.
true. Yeah, no, it's very true. And I think the reason that we call it flex lecture space is the idea that obviously it can be used for direct instruction, symposia, lectures, etc., but also that it could serve as a gallery. And so it could, serve as a space where you go and see work, as well as to go and hear about work. And that it would be supported by a myriad of kind of public program, endeavors or goals. So, yeah.
So you described this project as structured as a hovering, quote, building in a building. Explain to our listeners. I can see it because I'm looking at the
Yeah,
pictures.
yeah.
They're not seeing the pictures yet. Explain
Yeah.
to our listeners what you mean by that.
Sure. So the building in a building, I guess it's both practical and conceptual. So it's both literal and metaphorical. And so it's literally a building within a building because it's a project, sitting on 62 caissons, on a foundation, kind of built up from there that is seismically separated from the existing structure, meaning it doesn't rely on the existing structure in any way, and moreover, has to be separated from the existing structure in its entirety. So it's quite literally a building within a building. And if we were touring, I could take you like, in the closets or the kind of interstitial spaces and point up to the gap, from the concrete structural deck to the existing structure. You can see that it's floating. So, I mean, that's the kind of literal or practical part. But conceptually, we wanted to do our best to create something with a poetic link to the history of the building, and so we really try to create as best you can with architecture a sense of kind of floating or hovering or kind of objects that are floating within a building. So even, I guess, even within our own diagram, there are pieces which are kind of buildings within buildings, if that makes sense. So it's a little bit nested in a way. So the whole thing is floating in the shell, and then there's a piece that's again floating within itself. If that makes sense.
It does, because I'm looking at it. This being such a unique and interesting space in a myriad of different ways, tell me about a couple of the design challenges you faced in
Yeah.
transforming this space
Hmm.
into what you needed it to be, and what you learned from that.
Yeah. Eh, You know, so it's a really interesting question, and I think part of the challenge, it's not a challenge, I guess, but we've had the great privilege of doing a lot of renovation projects for Art Center. Some of them, within the iconic historic Craig Elwood building, where you have to really ask yourself some very challenging questions, in order to operate as an architect. And I think we treat each kind of building as almost as a character that we have to come to know, that we have to come to understand. Um, and almost know as a character in order to operate within it. And I would say that was true of the 870 project for sure. And so there's this moment where you realize what the beautiful traits are of the building as you would a human being. And then you try not, you go like, well, I can't mess those up. No, so it's like, so whatever, like we're going to do what we're going to do, but we cannot mess up the good parts of what's there. And so, being faced with this big, beautiful, potentially empty vessel, was the wind tunnel, was really daunting, to be honest. And to know like, okay, well, roughly speaking, we need to double the square footage, we need to quadruple the student population in this space, but somehow we have to maintain the beauty and integrity of the volume of the space, because it's you walk in and you feel it, it's like visceral. And so I mean, in some ways, like, I think about these things as a teacher as much as an architect, and so I think like, well, what's the most fundamental way to think about the problem? And so the question is, this is a conundrum only an architect could invent, right? So it's like, well, so we have this volume, like, are we subtracting, like, are we removing things in order to reveal the volume, or are we putting things in, in order to putting things in is easy because you're like, oh, of course we're putting stuff in. But thinking about like you remove things in order to reveal something, that flip, and of course, it was both of those things, but there's that moment where it just feels really daunting. It's like, okay, we know we can't mess it up. And so in the end, part of the, part of the agenda of the project was to make sure that we were, continue to reveal those big, beautiful, kind of voluminous spaces, and that we did so in support of the program, which I think we did. Yeah.
Looking at these pictures, it would have been very easy to destroy the character. And I mean, I can feel this space through pictures. And I'm not an architect. I
Yeah.
am just I've worked in this industry for my entire
Right.
career, but I'm not an
Right.
architect. So
Yeah.
everything I respond to is emotional. It's not, I'm not getting, the technical details are not getting into my head. I want to see how that space is going to make me feel. And looking at what you had to work with and what it has ended up being. Um, wow. And I don't say anything I don't mean, just so you know that, uh, you really did a fantastic job of keeping that history and that original personality and the
Yeah.
statement that this space makes
Yeah.
while still bringing in all the new that you needed to bring in. The blend
Right.
is incredible.
Yeah.
And I'm not
Thank you.
easily impressed. And
Oh, that's nice. Thank you.
I
Yeah.
just I was really curious about that because it would
Mhm.
have been easy to butcher this project.
Yeah. Yeah, most definitely. Yeah, for sure. And especially given what we needed to do within it. And we did earlier studies kind of more conceptual, going like, how full could we, like, how much could we fill the wind tunnel space and still maintain the integrity of the space? And a couple shout outs. One is, I always say we because I don't do anything by myself. And
Right.
especially my studio director, Sandra Hutchings, is really my design partner, in this work, especially the Art Center work. So to acknowledge her. And then looking at the images and the whole team, an incredible team here at DJA, architects, designers, everything. And I'm sure you'll list the names. I hope that all the names that I gave you, but also shout out to Josh White, the photographer that we've been working with for over 20 years, because that being able to convey the power of the space through imagery, like that's what Josh does. And so we're so grateful for that.
He also does that well. I can't take a picture to
Yeah.
save my life. I see
He
it
is
and
such a pro. Yeah.
oh gosh, I wish I had even a fraction of that talent because then I look at my picture and I go, well, this doesn't look all notable like what I'm looking at with my eyeballs.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah,
Understood.
I
Yeah.
just, I'm the analytical type. I don't have that design piece. I just know I like what I like, and it's a beautiful space and still feels very open and very spacious. You didn't overfill it, which would have been
Yeah,
really easy to do.
for sure.
I love that Art Center recognize the value that you don't have to fill a space with classrooms.
Yeah.
And
Yeah,
that,
yeah.
I would guess a school like that is probably better equipped to recognize that. But still, I love that they didn't do that.
Yeah,
That there's
incredible collaborators. I mean, really just I mean, I can't say enough good things about Art Center and our relationship with them and, all the folks over there. Yeah.
well, they get a shout out from me.
Rollin Homer, yeah. Especially, yeah.
um, so describe for me the notable spaces within here. You did a pretty broad description. Let's get into a little bit more detail of what is in each one of these
Yeah,
spaces.
yeah. So, let's see. So I think let me just for, you know, without fear of repeating myself, let me give you the broad strokes of the diagram again, and then we'll get from the neighborhood. We'll go from the neighborhood to the street. So,
Okay.
in terms of the overall diagram, like I was saying earlier, along the east side of the project, we laminated all the kind of cellular spaces, so studios, classrooms, offices, and those spaces we kind of laminated so it's a block, within the wind tunnel space that then allows the rest of it to be kind of open, right? And so then within that space we floated, ideally, that's the concept. We floated these other spaces. So the undergrad studio, the flex lecture space, and then all connected with circulation by kind of curving, looping ramp that you see in that one kind of iconic image. And so that's the broad strokes diagram. Along the western edge, there's a circulatory connection. So anyone walking from 870 to the north all the way to 1111 to the south would pass through this building along the western edge. It's public pass through. So then in the middle of our project is the area that we call the street. And I think ideally those are the spaces where the most, experimentation and forward thinking things would happen within the discipline, within the transportation design discipline. So the first space that you see when you enter is the art and process lab. And so that's the space in the photograph that's kind of a keyhole, right? So you have the ramping curving gallery, kind of as an oculus that gives you a view of that floating studio. But the space that you're in is the art and process lab. And so that space is really conceived as a place to, understand the power and importance of the development of high-end surfaces, right? So the kind of the styling of the automobile in kind of optimal lighting conditions. And so I mean, it functions like for us conceptually, it's a gallery, but for them, it's a working space, but in that kind of like high end, developed surface realm, right? The beauty of the automobile as a piece of art. And then if you move down the street to the north, right? So you pass under the undergrad studio, the hovering space, and through, and then you're in the next big cutout. So I'm going to the volume, so it's no mistake that I'm saying the notable spaces are the spaces that go boom all the way up to the trusses, right? So in the middle, there's a cutout. That's the vehicle architecture lab, and there's an automotive lift in that space. And it's the only space in the project where you see all of the levels at the same time. So you have basically level one, you're on the mezzanine level, then it goes up and around to level two, all looking down into space. And one of the kind of things that the chairs were really adamant about is that you see the objects from multiple vantage points. And so from, down looking up looking down, so on and so forth. And so in that space, there's a vehicle architecture lift, and that space is about the anatomy of the vehicle. So the structure of the vehicle as it relates to mechanical, electrical components, occupant. So the students really understanding like, well, kind of like architects, right? Like, what are the parts and pieces that we're working with, and how does it relate to the experience, a kind of the experience of the vehicle? So that's the vehicle architecture lab, and then you pass through in the last kind of extra large space. Uh, the art and process lab looks down on it, and in that space is the fabrication lab, and that's where they'll anything from like working on full scale mock-ups, bucks, electronics, soft goods, models. In that space, students will be doing what they called at the time kind of clean and quiet fabrication. So the shops are adjacent to the north. And so this is a direct connection to the shops. And in that space, you have these gorilla doors, which were part of an earlier renovation by Kevin Daly and Chris Skennick. So those gorilla doors are like 16 feet wide and like 40 feet tall. So when you open them, you could literally drive a London double-decker bus into that kind of fabrication space. Yeah, so I think those are the spaces that I would talk about as kind of notable spaces. And then the other is just an orchestration of, working and direct instruction spaces that happen throughout the school.
So I'm going to change up my next question a little bit. Um, in reference to and another quote, vehicle intensive spaces that
Yeah,
facilitate research. So you just described a couple of those spaces.
yeah.
Um, I would imagine that you had to design around and consider some things in those spaces that you normally as an architect don't have to think about,
Yeah,
because you wouldn't it's a very unique facility with unique
yeah,
needs.
yeah.
Um, what were some of the more unique things within those research spaces that you had to figure out how to design or how to specify into your project, that you hadn't
Mhm.
worked with before?
Yeah, I mean, if it's specifically the unique things, I would say, um, well, just off the top of my head, so one of the things that we had to do was to figure out how to have kind of floor to ceiling projection space within the art and process lab. But to actually have it work in a way that it wouldn't, when it wasn't being used, it wouldn't disrupt the kind of the aesthetics and the architecture. And so it was not super technical, but that was a problem to solve. And so there's an extra large kind of short throw projector that drops down out of that curving ramp, the bottom of the curving ramping gallery, and then projects onto, like, from floor to ceiling, projects onto the wall of the space. And then, I mean, there's actually a lot of things, like, we've never, designed a space around a vehicle lift before, for instance, and so understanding, like, well, what type of lift is it? How does it lift the car? What are the foundation requirements? What are the clearance requirements? And, all of those things. Um, and then, the other thing is, like, and this isn't really, I don't think it's highly technical, but was sort of highly necessary, is that in terms of the vehicle intensive part, right? Like, all that meant ultimately is that we had to be able to get, a vehicle. I think we used, like, the Chevy Tahoe as, like, the as our kind of litmus test, like the big extra XL vehicle. Not the London double decker bus can get in, but and out at the end, but it can't get all through. But in terms of getting through all of the spaces throughout on level one, we just had to make sure that, like, all the studios had kind of auto dealer, like car auto dealer doors on them. So any given studio, you could move a vehicle into it, as well as all the spaces, along the street, from that kind of gorilla door um, access. And then, I guess maybe this is another space that we design that's in that realm of, let's say, vehicle intensive and experimentation, um, was the mobility lab by Genesis, Hyundai, and Kia, which is just to the north west of the wind tunnel. We designed as part of this project. And that project is really about, experimentation for the vehicle experience and the vehicle journey. And so we had to create not a scenario, but a kind of atmosphere that would allow them to engage in those experiments, which meant, like, a flexible kind of ceiling grid for projection, lighting, and sound, and areas for cordoning off smaller spaces, a big curving screen to allow for projection and kind of experience within a vehicular buck. And so, yeah, I mean, I guess it's interesting. There were a lot of things that were maybe outside the realm of expertise that we had developed working on other spaces. A lot of it was within our expertise, but that some of the things were outside our experience with that we had developed in our expertise with Art Center. Um, but we just really dig in and try and figure out what the end goals are, what the user goals are, and really try and account for them. And yeah. Yeah, and really keep track of what, ultimately what the goals are. And the things change, and sometimes people don't know. They're like, "Well, we're not exactly sure what we're gonna use the space for." It has to be super flexible. Yeah.
Well, I mean, I've worked on probably every project type known to man by this point in my career, and I've never had to work on a project where we had to be able to move a vehicle around on the
Yeah.
inside.
Yeah. 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 Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so when you
Perfect
have those
example.
those
Yeah.
unique conditions
Hmm.
often come with, how do we make this happen?
Yeah.
It's not your
Yeah.
typical, and I think a lot of growth as a design professional comes from these unique situations where then you go to another project later, and while maybe that project is completely different,
Yeah.
something you learn from this pops an idea in your head. Oh, wait,
Totally.
I could do something along those lines here and
Yeah.
solve this other problem.
Totally.
So I love it when they get weird and they get
Yeah.
different and they have unique
Yeah.
requirements.
Yeah. No, it makes it, and it creates exciting design opportunities, so the need for vehicular doors or for these giant, Fleetwood Edge sliding doors to open up the whole street space, like those, they create opportunities, that really enrich the design. And I mean, I have to say, like, we've been so fortunate in our experience with Art Center in that we have been able to work on so many different project types, from cafes to galleries to, theaters and, lecture halls and classrooms and the whole offices, the whole range of things, which is pretty rare, to get that experience, especially from a single client. So feel super fortunate.
I bet. Your project information said, another quote, lots of quotes in this one, that the wind tunnel, originally designed to simulate motion
Uh-huh.
by testing objects fixed in space, has been converted to accept actual motion.
Yeah.
So, what exactly do you mean by that?
Yeah. It is something cool to say.
Okay.
Yeah, I'll just,
I say, hey, I'll take it. It sounded so cool. I
no,
had to
no,
ask about
no,
it.
no, no. It's really comes from somewhere. So we were working on the project, and I guess, and just in that realm of really trying to understand, like, the origins of the place and what it means to work there in that space and all that. We Art Center has a great archive, and so they have historical photos and they have historical artist renderings of the wind tunnel machine and the transonic card and all of that stuff, right? And so that's always kicking around in the back of my mind, and I would use it even as material to orient consultants to the project and say, this is what we're working on, this is what it's about. And so understanding also the history of the place. And so early on in the project, we were doing these diagrams to understand, like, okay, where can the vehicles go? Like, what's the pathway for the vehicle within the space? And then in a very early version of the project, there was a ramp that also went up to level 2. So that kind of curving ramping gallery that goes just from the mezzanine to level 2 used to go from level 1 all the way up to level 2. So vehicles, ostensibly could be, in all levels of the project, or at least level 1, level 2. Um, but the point of my story, and then also the idea of pedestrians passing through. So you have people passing through, you have, vehicles passing in and around. And so as we're doing these diagrams, it just kind of dawned on me, like, well, we're trying to figure out how to accept various modes of motion within the space, which is kind of ironic given that it was full of this giant machine that was used to simulate motion. And so that's where the quote came from, just those kind of thoughts kicking around in my brain.
Well, I love that though. You informed your design, keeping that history
Yeah.
and with its own little twist.
Hmm.
Well, now I know what it means. I needed to know that. My life was not going to be complete until I knew that. Tell me a little bit about the interior finish and the aesthetics. I did not realize until you told me this a little while ago that kind of ellipse was actually a
Yeah.
ramp. I
Yeah.
did not see
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
little
Yeah.
in the
Yeah.
picture I have open. I did not see that little
Yeah.
person standing up there. I just thought it
Yeah.
was a thing. It's actually
Yeah.
functional,
It
which makes
is.
it even
Yeah.
cooler.
And if
Um,
there are any building inspectors watching this or listening to this podcast, it's actually a sloping walkway. It's not technically a ramp, but
okay. Okay. I stand no, I get it. I stand corrected. That was my word, not the project's word. It's a sloping
uh,
walkway. Totally different animal.
yeah, yeah. No, I'm just kidding. It's fully accessible.
So, interior finishes and
Yeah.
aesthetics, what were you looking to achieve? I mean,
Yeah.
I get it from my perspective, but
Sure.
explain to our listeners, as you picked the
Yeah.
different materials and things that you chose, what
Yeah.
some of those were and what you wanted to achieve with that vibe.
Definitely. Yeah, I mean, I think so there's a few things to talk about. I mean, probably more than a few, but we knew that we wanted to create something which was taut and crisp and had, elements of lightness. And we knew that we wanted to stick to a very limited palette of kind of whites and grays and silvers and maybe a tiny bit of black. And, keying into what we I think developed over time as a kind of aesthetic that also works for Art Center. But we really wanted to create something in, in deep contrast to the kind of roughness and the materiality of the wind tunnel. And so in some ways our project is not entirely, but in some ways it's kind of a material, meaning you might look at it and not really know what it is that you're looking at. That would never happen. You're looking at the wooden roof, right? Like you can literally see each stick, each board, how it was made. Like you can read it, but we wanted to create something that was kind of taut and crisp and abstract. And I think it's important to say, like, you know, maybe this is just for me, but like vehicles and architecture are not the same thing. And so we're operating, with a different set of materials, a different tool set, a different set of agendas and criteria. And so we're also creating an environment which is in contrast to these beautiful, works of art that get kind of parked in there or designed in there. And so I think that's part of the aesthetic agenda as well. If that does that answer your question?
Yeah, no, it does, and I hadn't thought about it that way until you described it, that, creating these beautiful vehicles, whatever kind of vehicle it is, um, that's the ultimate goal of this space,
It is
is to
absolutely. Yeah.
achieve that, and
Yeah.
so once you do, you don't want the space to take away from that creation. That's what you're there to learn how to do.
Exactly.
Um,
Yeah.
and because I think the space is really notable, but I can see the contrast to,
Mhm.
let's just say it's this beautiful Lamborghini, or
Yeah.
pick your poison. Mine's a
Yep.
Bugatti. I want a
You and Peter
Bugatti.
Mullin, the donor, I mean, the donor of the donor, for the project, Peter Mullin, who sadly passed away before we finished the project, but, avid, Bugatti collector, French car enthusiast. So, yeah, you're in
But
good company.
you take that car, well, I'll never have one, I'm pretty sure, but you take that car and you put it in the middle of this space,
Yeah.
and that car is going to shine in this space, even
Absolutely.
with
Yeah,
as
yeah.
notable as the space is.
Yeah,
Uh,
ideally.
I
Mhm.
love that.
Yeah.
What are there a couple of interesting or unique products that that you used
But
in here, or even average products you used in a unique way? I've heard a lot of stories about somebody taking this thing we all use all the time, but then doing some weird thing with it that is totally notable that you'd like to highlight and tell me about.
yeah, no, absolutely. And I think the first one I'd like to point out is a kind of story and an acknowledgement in a way. So there's an art center uh, alumni who actually is a creative director for a lighting company. He graduated from the automotive design department. His name is Scott Yu, and the company is Vode Lighting. And so from the very first project at 870, all the way through probably all of our projects at Art Center, we've used Vode lighting. But I think in this project, in a way, the usage is most notable because it's for the department that he graduated out of. And then if you're looking at the photos, you'll see a kind of field of very, very slim linear lights floating kind of in the wind tunnel space. So those lights provide general illumination for the space down, but they also light up. And so they actually light the barrel vaulted roof at the same time that they're lighting the space. So in that single kind of minimal project, and Vode Lighting is just brilliant at really getting lighting down to its very essence. And with LED, the advances that they've made have been incredible in terms of the aesthetics of their lighting. But we were able to both kind of, highlight our work and then also really highlight the wind tunnel space and really hopefully emphasize the contrast between the two.
I don't
So
think I
sorry
I
that,
would have thought about that lighting.
yeah, yeah. So that's one thing. And then, I mean, the other thing maybe that is a little boring to talk about, but that really became a really important factor in the project is that, you know, the wind tunnel space itself, and then certainly potentially the things we were putting in, you're looking at all hard surfaces, which are very sonically reverberant. And so the space could have been super live and really, really loud. If you imagine 200 students kind of working, passing through, working in open studios, et cetera. And so we really had to work to provide sound absorption in various ways. And so one of the ways that we do that is like on the big hovering elements, you have these kind of geometrically indented faces. So those faces, which look like plaster, they're actually acoustical gypboard assemblies, which look like plaster, but they're highly absorptive. Initially, we started with Boswelfauna and that material got value engineered out, but the face of the curving ramping gallery, the underside of the soffits, the faces of the hovering elements, those are all absorptive. So that's one kind of absorptive material. Then as you move under the hovering pieces, you'll see these kind of these lines of gray kind of panels, and those are all high density felt there. Oh shoot, what it's Curie makes them. Echo Panel is the name of the product,
Okay.
and so those are all sonically absorptive as well, but just look like part of the fabric or the aesthetic of the project. And then lastly, in the building within a building realm, all the rooftops are all this is really boring, but they're all sprayed with this K13 absorptive material. But then the other thing that we did that I hope you would never know without me telling you is that we sprayed the walls of the wind tunnel with this K13 material as well, which it's integrated color, and when it's sprayed on, it just looks like tunnel dash stucco. So it just looks really rough. And I think vibes really well with the aesthetic of the wind tunnel. So that was the kind of that's the only intervention that we did kind of to the shell. And again, it was just to get as much absorption as possible. And the public spaces are really uh well, sonically we say dead, but they're really like they're not live. They're much quieter because of all that absorption. So I would say light and sound, and I mean these are lessons we learned also designing the Amundsen auditorium for Art Center, which is your point earlier about one project transfers to another. Like we learned so many lessons about absorption and lighting and kind of a contained experience. So yeah, those are some products.
That's interesting. I hadn't thought about a space like that could be very live,
Oh my
especially if
gosh,
you
super live.
start pulling a car in. But
Yeah.
I'm looking at those walls that you just described with the sprayed material, which I would not have known had you not told me that. But that is a pretty creative way any big open space is going to give you
Yeah.
some challenges when it comes to
With hard
acoustics.
surfaces, yeah,
Yeah,
definitely.
and
Yeah,
that's certainly not a solution that I think I've ever seen before that I'm aware of. I may have seen it somewhere and
yeah,
didn't know what I was looking
yeah,
at,
yeah.
but
It becomes a
that's an
background thing. Yeah,
interesting way to help with that. With
yeah,
especially with a bunch of students, it's not going to be a quiet space. It's not a library.
yeah,
People are
yeah,
doing and
exactly.
making, and
Yeah.
it was hard to tell from the pictures, and so
Hmm.
this may be a question that we don't even um, need to answer, but was there any exterior work at all on this project, or is this completely interior work?
It mostly is completely interior. That initially, so right now you can get, vehicles and extra large vehicles in through the north end of the building through these giant gorilla doors. Initially, we had redesigned the glass entry, the main entry, which is to the south of the building, so that it could be opened up so that a vehicle could pass through that portal. But we that got value engineered out during the process, and so we didn't end up doing that. The only thing we did to the exterior was there's a skylight, which was part of the Daily Gannett renovation, which runs along the kind of top of the barrel vault from kind of north-south, right? Um, and that skylight, we just put a film on it to diffuse and soften the light, especially for the art and process lab. Um, and then obviously, we did a lot of mechanical and electrical work and stuff that happened, on the rooftops and stuff. But in terms of the aesthetic of the exterior of the building, we didn't change anything at all. Yeah.
I actually pored over the pictures for a while trying to figure out whether I wanted to include that question
Yeah.
because I'm like,
No,
it's a
I think
building within
I
a
like the
building.
question. Yeah. 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 No, but I like the question because I think there are always things that have to happen. So, yeah.
Right. Well, if there was something, I was going to find out about it. I have an affinity of asking this question for projects in California. Um, I know, and we have an office in California, and I've previously
Yeah.
worked at firms that had offices in California, so I have some experience here, which
Yeah.
is why
Oh,
I
yeah.
asked
Yeah.
this question.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
typically, the permit and approvals process can sometimes be challenging in California, and it can also be lengthy. And depending on, I don't know with the age of this building whether there's any additional historic elements, but how did your permitting and approval processes and design review processes go for this building? Because sometimes it gets even more challenging when it's an older building with older systems. What did that look
Yeah.
like? Were there any challenges there, or did it go pretty smoothly?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. And I would say a few things. One is generally speaking, like high level, I think it went incredibly smoothly and probably from the time we submitted until the time we pulled a permit, with the normal kind of back and forth, we were looking at all things considered, it was very smooth, right? So I mean, Art Center has a good relationship with the city, with the jurisdictional agency. And so from start to finish, from the time we permitted, submitted for permit, pulled the permits was 6 months, which I think is very reasonable with a kind of back and forth. Um, but a few other things. I mean, one is the project was renovated in the early thousands, and so you were dealing with infrastructure systems and occupancy, and that's based on that renovation, which I'm sure helped a tremendous amount. And then the other thing is that during the design process, we met with building and safety and planning and fire on more than one occasion and basically said like we had also a code expert. And so we say, we're interpreting the code in the following way. We're occupying the space in the following way. We're exiting it in this way. Does this make sense to you? There would be a back and forth. And so by the time we submitted, we knew that you know, conceptually, it's not in the minutia, but in the concept of the project, that we were on the same page, to so to speak, to use an overused metaphor. We're on the same page with the departments within the city, and I think that probably made a huge difference as well. But I think, you know, the other thing I would say is like we recently permitted an ADU in the city of Los Angeles, and it took a year, and it was a total nightmare. This is like a 1,200 square foot project versus a 32,000 square foot project, and the little tiny ADU took way longer and was way more, agency approvals and clearances and jurisdictional entanglements than the big project. So, yeah.
It's
So
funny you mentioned
stories
that.
from the field. I know
Yeah.
we could got with this. We could do a podcast just on this.
Oh, well, it's just, I find it ironic that you mentioned ADUs because when you said it took 6 months, about 6 months, I was thinking to myself, wow, that's amazing. So I have an an architect friend who recently
Yeah.
went through an 18-month approval process for an ADU,
Yeah. Yeah.
not a big,
I know.
full-size project. And I'm like, and I've heard of people with going as long as 2 years.
I know.
So that's, to me, seems absolutely insane. So I'm glad you didn't have to
Yeah.
go through that.
No, we didn't. Yeah, we're very, very fortunate in that regard. Yeah.
I have another rabbit hole question.
Please.
May or may not be a stupid question. Um, as you've been talking, this keeps popping up in my head, so I'm just going to
Yeah,
ask.
please.
So, obviously, the space is meant so that you can get vehicles in and out of it because of the program it is. And so I started thinking vehicles,
Yeah.
exhaust,
Yeah, yeah. Good
inside.
question. Can't
What did
do
you
it.
have to do with your mechanical
You
systems, or
cannot do it. No, you cannot do
so
it. You
they can't
cannot, you
drive them
can,
in?
you absolutely cannot drive a vehicle in. It has to
Okay.
be. So what happens is that, if you have a fully functioning, a vehicle that operates, unless it's electric, you cannot drive it in. And so they have these things called go jacks, which are basically these little elements with four wheels that then the car wheels go on. And so imagine a car, four wheels. Each wheel is sitting on a kind of dolly that has four wheels, which means you can push the vehicle in any direction, right? Forward, backward, sideways, turn it around in a circle. And so they bring the vehicles in on the go jacks, sometimes pushing them, and then they can be towed. So you can use an electric vehicle in the space. You cannot store an electric vehicle in the space because the batteries are a potential fire hazard. And so, yeah, that was a big factor. That's a no go, and that's also a lesson that we learned because we had designed the Mullin Gallery on level 1 of the 1111 building, which was, first designed as a gallery for vehicles, basically. And so that was a lesson that we learned in that project as well.
Well,
Yeah.
I'm glad I asked it. Asked 'cause I started
Yeah.
thinking, wait a minute, are they driving
I know, and
around?
when you and
Built?
you know when we were talking, you were saying like, "Yeah, you can just drive a car right in here." In my head, I was like, "No, actually."
No, no. Obviously, that was
You could
popping up in
push
my
a
head as
car in. You
well.
could push the car in. Yeah. No, good question.
Makes all, and I actually know what a go jack is, but it it that makes more sense now because I was trying to picture like how are you just HVAC systems and things like
Yeah.
that. How would you manage that indoors? That wouldn't be healthy. So okay, now I understand. So, and I think we chatted a little bit about this to a certain degree before we even started recording. I strongly
Yeah.
believe, that some of our most important lessons
Mm.
we learn on the design side come from watching our designs get built during the construction phase, and seeing whether the things that were envisioned actually come together the way we wanted them to, or some of all every there's no such thing as a construction phase without challenges and things that come up, the unexpected things. Tell me what the construction phase of this project looked like. This mostly wood structure nestled in this collection of concrete buildings, that wraps it by three sides. Kind of curious what that construction phase looked like.
Yeah. So much to potentially talk about here. So I think, part of the kind of, oh gosh, there's a lot of things to talk about, but part of, what it looks like during the process is the kind of makeup, seeing the makeup of the project kind of emerge. And I will say we had plenty of time to do that because it was scheduled for 1 year of construction and it actually took 2 years. So there's challenge number one, and I can explain why. But so we had a lot of time to see it kind of emerge. But basically, you have the caissons, right? So you have 63 caissons that are being drilled and dug, and that's a whole story unto itself. Grade beams, and then the bearing structure, which on level 1 is cast in place concrete columns, CMU bearing walls, which eventually got encapsulated by finishes, and then a cast in place concrete deck, part of which was post tensioned because it needed to be quite thin, and then light metal framing and chipboard and all of the other windows and doors and all of that stuff. So, obviously you get to see the project, and actually we have amazing real time video sequences because the contractors had cameras at both ends of the project. So you can go on our Instagram and see the project like easy 2 years of work happen. So there's that, and then I think, you know, I came away, and I maybe we'll talk about this, a little bit later more, but I came away feeling really a spirit of collaboration with the contractor, and we're really hands on, and we engaged them really early on with the best tools that we could, and so we had, you know, very simple AR things, using iPads where you could go in the space and then see, oh, there's the art and process lab, there are the classrooms, and then peel away the chipboard, there's the framing, and really see the layers. And then you know, we worked so long on the project that, the details, the areas that were really complex where many things were coming together. So you have like a complex cast in place concrete structural beams and columns and slabs, and then you have framing, and then the finishes. Like those areas, we built kind of large-ish chunk models, that we just took to the construction office and said, "That piece that's going up, whatever, in 6 months, maybe 12 months, these are all the layers," and we would pull it apart. They loved it, they absolutely loved it, and that there was that commitment and a kind of level of engagement that, allowed us, the whole team, to kind of learn from each other. So, yeah. Does
So
that does that really answer your question? I don't know.
yeah, no, it does. Everybody, I always ask some question about the construction phase, and the perspectives are so wide ranging of what stood out for a particular person, or what crazy thing happened that they didn't expect, or those kinds of things.
No. Yeah.
And I don't know if you have this planned for one of our final few questions. So if you do, you can just tell me. But
Yeah.
why did it take 2 years instead of one?
Yeah, I'll tell you, it's for that, like, challenges, like the challenges of construction. So, yeah, so okay, interesting story. So, um, think about what I was talking about earlier, that the wind tunnel space was filled with a giant machine. So that machine gets decommissioned and gets removed, and then the Decor Appliance Company comes in. So Decor Appliance Company just fills in the space, you know, catch as catch can, and nothing got demoed. We realized later, they just put fill dirt and gravel and whatever, or concrete slurry, and then put a slab over the top of it. So we have 63, I keep saying the same number. So we have 63 caissons we need to dig. And then they start, core through the concrete, start drilling the hole, and they're like, oh, we hit a foundation. Like, we can't, what do we do? And so they would be like, they being the contractor, they said, can we move this caisson from here to here? And I would go to the structural engineer, can we move this? Yes, we can. We'll attach it with a grade beam. And then, but it kept happening. So they would drill, and they'd be like, oh, we hit a giant pit. No, there's a tank here and we don't know what to do. So we kept moving. So, or they would drill a hole, and there would be pea gravel, and it would just be pouring in. So, and undermining the adjacent slab. It was really something. And then we would move the caisson. And then at one point they hit a foundation, and I was like, come on, give me a break. Like, you have these giant drill rigs, like, just get a more sturdier bit, like, just drill through it. Can we just stop with this whack-a-mole with caissons? They're like, we can do that. And so they did. And it was 16 feet of solid concrete. I'm not even making this up. It took 2 days to drill through. And then I was like, no, let's not do that. That's not, let's go back to the whack-a-mole. And so, I mean, like, the foundation took a year, basically, I mean, that's a little bit of an exaggeration, but if you say demo, pre-con, blah, 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 from the time we started, on site, like having meetings on site, until the time, like, the foundation was ready to receive the primary structure, was a year. And it was a big strain on the project contingency as well. And we did, which we had never done before, some midstream value engineering, where we were like, oh, projecting to the end of the project, we'll be out of money. So there are things we had to do during construction, which is, is a challenge unto itself. But anyway, yeah, so that was really the primary challenge for the project. So
That's a pretty
it was
big
it was.
16 feet.
Yeah, I know. No, I
That's,
know.
oh, nobody was
Yeah.
happy that day.
No.
No.
Yep. No. There were a lot of unhappy days when we were working on the foundation, I have to say. Yeah.
I would imagine after
Yeah.
finding that the whack-a-mole looked considerably better. And I'm gonna be stealing that um, when you have to do those kind of hit and miss kind of changes,
Yeah, exactly.
which I have to do in specs sometimes. That's going to become
Mhm.
my whack-a-mole
Yeah, oh,
procedures.
I'm sure. Definitely.
So, were there any sustainability efforts
Mhm.
of any note made on this
Yeah.
project?
Yeah, definitely. So the project is LEED Gold certified. So it's our first LEED Gold certified project. So we worked with a consultant, ZC Sustainability. They worked with us all through the process, and then also worked with the contractor in the documentation process. And so we were able to achieve LEED Gold, which I thought we were kind of tracking just LEED certified. So the fact that we were able to achieve gold status, I think, is pretty cool. Um, and then, but I think, you know, architecture is a very unsustainable act. Like building stuff is, you know, one, if not the most challenging thing that one can do in relationship to the environment. Like it's really a challenging thing. And so anytime you can reuse something that already exists, then you're doing better in that department. And that's not something that we did or chose to do. As something we inherited, but I think it's part of the sustainability equation of the project, that the kind of, the embodied energy and what we were able to save, by just not changing the envelope, and, adaptively reusing what was there wherever we could. And that goes to infrastructure too, like reusing in part the existing HVAC, electrical systems, et cetera. So yeah, so I think achieving LEED Gold, I think is obviously, we're proud of that, but I think kudos to the school. And then also as part of that process, the school has made a commitment basically to not change the space for a minimum of 10 years, to use it as it is and not to, renovate or change it. And so that's a big deal too, because again, there can be these kind of perpetual projects that, it impacts the environment. There's no way around that. So
It's I find it interesting in all the talking we're doing about sustainability at all different levels and the ways that we can, you know, get healthier buildings. Well, I know people are. I mean, I have guests. I had one guest call it radical reuse, um, but I don't hear people talking about that. And it is such a notable way to be more sustainable
it is.
in
Mhm.
adapting a space you already have rather than
Yeah.
tearing it down and rebuilding
Yep.
something new is such just in and of itself. If you did not one other sustainable thing in that building,
Yep.
you've just done something huge there. And
Yep.
while I am hearing more architects talking about it, just industry wide, I feel that that kind of is not highlighted as much as it should be.
I agree.
People are
Yeah.
talking about it, but I mean, you'll hear everybody on the planet talking about sustainable materials and the red list and
Yeah.
all of that everywhere you look.
Okay.
But you don't hear people saying, hey, really digging into adaptive reuse or radical reuse, in the words of
Yeah.
um, my past guests, which I love that term. Um, I,
And
I, I wish
to
we'd see people focusing on really digging into, because it's not always more expensive. It might be a little more challenging.
Yeah,
Um, Sometimes it ends up being less expensive depending on your approach and what you have
definitely.
to work with. But
Yeah, definitely. I mean, the other side of the equation is like, design good stuff so that people don't have to tear it down. What I mean? I mean, things change. Like times change, things change, and so things evolve. But you know, don't design disposable projects. Like try your best to design things that will be lived into and used for many many years to come, because that's a sustainable act in and of itself.
that, yeah, that would be nice. I always, whenever we talk about disposable buildings, I don't know why, like the 70s. I I I don't know where the disconnect was in the 70s, but if I had to
That's funny.
pick one era of buildings that I'm
Yeah,
just like, were you all high the whole generation? Because
it's funny.
tear those down. Okay. We are lifelong learners in this profession, and you and I have already bonded over that little point. Tell me about one lesson you learned from this specific project that is going to make you a better architect on the next
Yeah,
project.
yeah. There are probably a lot of things, but I guess maybe because it's the freshest or the most recent, I think that, um, for most of my career, I just equate construction with conflict. Meaning that as you're building something, you're going to fight about everything from like, you know, uh, what constitutes acceptable work, what's an acceptable submittal, what's an acceptable timeline, like conflict, like timeline to return something, timeline to get like what you name it. And so I would like when I when I would put on a construction helmet and a vest, I would be like, okay, now I'm ready for battle. And what I learned on this project is that it doesn't have to be like that, that it can be a collaboration and that that when it is, the outcome is so much better. It's just so much better. And so I think maybe in part because we had time and adverse conditions to bond over the foundation. Like, so we're like, could go through something really difficult. Or like, man, we're all in this together. And then once that kind of pretense fell away, not to say that that things didn't come up, but um, there was mutual respect and a willingness to collaborate that I think at a level that I hadn't experienced before. And I mean, I credit that also to my team and the people that I had working in the field on the project as well. But that spirit of collaboration, I'll bring with me to every other project because once everyone is on board and everyone says like, okay, we understand what we want to achieve and we understand what your expectations are, you understand what our expectations are, then you can collaborate and then things get so much better. They just get so much better. 'Cause you can go out to the field and then this field super is like, you point to something and then he's like, uh, we're there. I already told them to fix that. That's not correct. That doesn't, it's not in the drawings, whatever. Instead of like pointing at something and like, wow, what do you mean that we did it this way because the drawings, wow, usually submittal, but whatever. So, anyway, that I'm just rambling now, but that spirit of collaboration, I think it shows in the final product. Yeah.
In my experience, there's nothing better than working with a really great contractor. And putting on my spec writer hat for just 12 seconds.
Mm.
Also having really good, solid,
Yeah.
properly written contract documents, meaning your
Yep.
drawings and your specifications, where you
100%.
outline all those rules for
Yep.
how long a submittal is going to go back and forth, or what you will and won't expect or
Absolutely.
accept. But
Yeah.
the problem is even when we write really good documents, when it comes to CA, oftentimes the project managers don't. I always tell my students, have a meeting before construction even
Yeah.
starts. Not the
We
pre-construction
did.
meeting about the
Yeah.
building,
Yeah. Yeah.
about
Yeah.
the rules of the road.
Yeah.
So everybody's on the same page before you
Yeah.
step off the cliff. And so nobody can say, I'm not going to give you a submittal schedule.
Yeah,
This
yeah,
is
yeah,
part of the
exactly.
contract. It's
No,
here.
that's right. Yeah,
Those
yeah,
kinds
yeah.
of things.
Absolutely. They were stellar at that. And we when we did the 870 project, from the time that we signed the contract until the time they occupied the building was 6 months. So design, development, permitting, construction, 6 months, 34,000 square feet, seismic retrofit, like gutted the works. Like that was my first big project. I had no idea what I was really getting into. But the point of my story is that in that trial by fire, we just returned submittals like boom, like nobody else. And so when we work with other contractors, it sets a tone in a way because they'll send a submittal and it's like, boom, it's returned. it's like, yes, technically we by the contract documents, we could take a week to do it, but you're going to have it, in 24 hours, 48 hours. And that's our commitment to the situation. So,
And that kind of commitment is a game changer. You have the week if you need it. Sometimes
yeah,
that might come up, but that not that I've seen in my history. I've
yeah,
got a week. I'm not even going to bother to look at it for 6 days.
right, right.
You know, and I'm so polar opposite. You put it on my desk, I need to get it done right now. I
Yeah,
don't want it piling up
same.
or delaying things. But
Yeah,
it is really, going back to emotional intelligence, which I bring up a lot as well, is we have to remember we're all trying to achieve the same thing. And we all
exactly.
benefit if
No,
we
it's
do
so
that
true. It's
well.
so easy to forget.
Yeah,
It's so easy to forget.
absolutely. So before we get to our two closing
Yeah.
questions,
Hmm.
give me a sneak peek at what I can expect to see from
Oh yeah. Hmm.
Darin. I want to make sure I get it right. Darin Johnstone Architects, because I was
That's
going to
right.
stumble over that
Yeah, yeah.
in the future. What are you working on now?
Yeah, so it's early days, like probably not a lot I can talk about in great detail, but we're working on what I'll call loosely like an environmental education center, which is a project that we're really fortunate in. The institution that we're working for is an incredibly benevolent institution that's doing good work in the world, and so hopefully we'll be able to share more about that. And then also, kind of early days feasibility for a recovery bridge housing project expansion for a project in Pasadena, and then other kind of various residential stuff that we're working on. But I think the the MTDC was kind of the culmination of almost a decade of work with ArtCenter. Many projects, and now we're starting to kind of find our way into other territories. So, yeah,
I saw that on your website because I always go troll my guests beyond the stuff you send me, and I was looking at your website, and I just like clicked on the first thing I saw Art Center on, and I went, wait a
yeah,
minute, this isn't the project. And
I
so I
know.
started looking down your
We're
list, and I'm
so
like,
lucky. Yeah,
wow, they've done a lot of stuff for
we did.
them.
We have.
Um,
We sure have. Yeah.
Quite the variety as well.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah. Very fortunate.
So I always close with two questions. The first being a more broad industry question. And yours is probably the longest broad industry question I've ever asked anybody. So, again, we mentioned earlier, you've taught at SciArc for years.
Yeah.
Um, Only one of your many efforts there,
Hmm.
because there was a whole list. I had to
Yeah.
make a
Yeah.
choice
Yeah.
here.
Sure.
Was SciArc's Introduction to Design program for high school students.
Right.
In my opinion, the general public is rather
Hmm.
clueless about what architects really do, the actual
Yeah.
practice of architecture. Their influence
Yeah.
comes from some movie, or they watched, I'm
Hmm.
going to age myself here, they watched the Brady Bunch, and the dad left every day with his roll of drawings.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, and I've done some mentoring of high schoolers as well, and many high schoolers
Hmm.
that are interested in pursuing an architecture degree
Yeah.
often pursue that without a real understanding, a real world
Sure.
understanding of what that means. The last firm I worked for prior to this one, we had an actual program in house at our firm with a whole term
Yeah.
with the local high school and their
Yeah.
students who were interested in design. And they're like, what is this? This isn't what I thought
Hmm.
architecture was going to
Right.
be.
Right. Right.
So my question for you is, what do you think we could be doing better in
Hmm.
AEC to not only educate the general public,
Hmm.
but also to expose younger people to our profession in a realistic way,
Hmm.
with the hope of sparking an interest in pursuing a career in architecture, but having a clear understanding of what they're pursuing
Yeah.
when they do so.
Yeah. I mean, it's such a tricky question in a way because I would say certainly when I entered architecture school, I didn't have a clear understanding about what the endeavor was, and I had worked, since I was 16 as a draftsperson, right? So I knew how to draw, and I knew that you made drawings to make buildings, but the endeavor of architecture as that big umbrella, I had no clue, you know? And so it unfolded. And I would say, like, having a clear understanding of what we do is like a lifetime endeavor. It's I mean, meaning like I'm still working on it. We talked about like, what did you learn from this and this and this?
Yeah.
And so I think it's would be a lot to ask to kind of deliver a clear understanding of what it is that we do. But I think, having so DID is a program that I created and then ran for 5 or 6 years and then kind of handed it off. It still exists at SciArc, and which is amazing, and it's something. One of the things I'm most proud of, in my career is that initiative and what it means for students. And some of those students, my earliest DID students, are, professors now in architecture. So, but I think one of the things that was really key to the program, so there's studio time and designing stuff, making stuff, and all that kind of fun stuff. But really, it's about the field trips and getting out in the world and seeing projects, right? Seeing architecture, which Los Angeles is amazing for that, right? You just take a walk outside of SciArc and literally see an incredible array of, world-class projects. And then visiting offices, so seeing like what's the makeup of an office? What do designers and architects do? What does this look like? And then as well as galleries and exhibits and shows and having meals together and all that stuff. So it's really about, get I think about getting out in the world and experiencing stuff, especially now. I mean, maybe this is just an old dude thing to say, but now that we're living in a world of screens and our primary mode of engagement is this, one-on-one with a screen, like getting out in the world and seeing stuff, especially if you want to put stuff into the world. And then like I again, like, architecture is a big enough umbrella that you can engage with that idea and you could land all kinds of places, and that's okay. That's okay too. Yeah.
I couldn't agree more. The program my last firm had, what I loved about it is they didn't just bring in these high school students because it was a whole term. They came in once or twice a week for a whole term. They didn't just show them, some of the design stuff.
Yeah.
They'd have me come in and do a whole session about specifications and contract
Sure.
documents. And they're
Yep.
all like, had no idea that kind of stuff even
Yeah.
existed. They would
Yeah.
take them out to the job site, to job site meetings, and go through some of that process. And they would show them all different pieces and parts of the profession just to get an exposure. Because not everybody who goes to architecture school is necessarily good at design,
No, it's
you
totally
know?
true. And then there are a lot of but they're all good at something.
Right.
But there's so many, and there's so many, again, like just so many aspects to what we do. From I would say from the discipline to the practice and everywhere in between. If the discipline is sort of what we do in academia and how we think about the endeavor, and practice is what we do in the world and how we actualize the endeavor, like that's for better or worse, like that's my world, just being, in those two, trying to be a bridge between those two realms. But
I would say if I was, I say this all the time, if I was queen of the world, I would force every architecture school. I know they have professional practice classes. Don't
yeah,
get me
yeah,
started on what I think professional practice is as opposed to what they teach in those classes. But I
sure.
think every architecture program would have a 1 year class that was required for the degree that was similar in nature to what my last firm did with those high school students, in exposing the students to, CA. And I just turned a recently licensed architect into a spec writer. She was like, I got into a firm. I'm finding I don't love design. What else can I do in architecture? To
Sure.
other pieces and parts.
Yeah.
I know another one that is working for a building science firm. Licensed. She also recently got licensed from some of my students that have come my way as well. And she's out on the job getting her hands dirty, and it's all about the building enclosure. There's just so many things out there. If they could just do 1 year of actually going out into the world, I think they would be far more realistic coming out of school when they walk into a firm of what to expect.
Yeah, it's such a I mean, it's a fair point, but it's such a tricky thing. Like, a professional architecture degree is already 5 years. It's 5 years that's loaded from start to finish, and then it's meant, as you know, meant to be complemented by 2 years of work experience. Then, you're eligible for licensure if you're so inclined, and then you can start taking the test, and then that takes as long as it takes, and so I think, um, you know I think every person kind of finds their own way, but I don't know. It's tricky. Like, I don't know about space to add things within the curriculum as we know it. But ostensibly those two years are meant to be kind of learning years and exposure years. But the truth is, like, students will also, work during summers or work during breaks, and they'll kind of find their way in that way as well. But I mean, it's a lot to deliver. And then if you're, getting a master's, then it becomes a 3-year endeavor, right? So you come with a degree in biology and decide you want to be an architect. Then we have 3 years to deliver the professional degree goods that we deliver in 5 for the undergrad. So yeah, the education of an architect yeah, it's quite an endeavor.
Well, and
Yeah.
I'm glad you highlighted that because most people don't understand that either.
Yeah.
Just
Yeah.
how much an architect has to go through. It's
Yeah.
not get your degree and just go work.
No.
If you want to,
Yeah.
well, number one, it's a 5-year degree. It's not 4, and then being licensed takes people anywhere from 2 to 10 years, depending on real life happening. Things at that age, getting married, having kids, having a full time demanding job. Um, all of this. You go to school as long as any doctor, um, and more than probably most lawyers.
Yeah.
Um, but
Yeah,
it
right, exactly.
doesn't always get the same professional respect, I think.
No, it's really true. Yeah.
Trust me,
Mm,
people, you don't want your building to fall down on your head.
yeah.
And these are the
Yes.
only people that know how to make sure that doesn't happen.
Yeah, yeah, right,
Um,
exactly.
so, final question,
Yeah,
easiest
okay.
question of the day.
Yeah,
And everybody gets this question that's on the
okay,
show.
cool.
We all hope to live a life that leaves some kind of contribution to make the world a better place. I would like to believe that we all hope to live that kind of life.
Yep.
So, personal or professional, either one,
Yeah,
what do you hope your impact will be? Or one of
yeah,
your impacts? Most of us are
yeah,
not going to hopefully not have just one.
yeah. I think, it makes me feel actually emotional to think about, but really fundamentally, and hopefully it's kind of borne out through this conversation. I'm a teacher. Like, that's what I am at my core. I'm a teacher first and foremost to my 3 sons, right? So I have three boys, one studying illustration, one studying film, one studying biochemistry. They're all college age, But first and foremost, I'm a teacher to them, and that's part of, my legacy. But if I do the math, I've been teaching for 25 years. I probably had over 1,000 students, over that time. And those students now, many of them are, architects, designers, executives, whatever, CEOs, professors, you name it, and in all different professions as well. And so I like to believe that for me, my legacy is in teaching, and that whatever I could do as a single human then is happening 1,000 times over, for better or worse. Like, and what that's what I got. I mean, and it took me a long time to figure that out, because when I first started teaching, I was just teaching so I could practice. And then I realized, like, oh, this is like my true calling. It's my vocation. It's the thing that, you know, makes me happiest and most fulfilled. And so, yeah, that's what it is.
Well, we're kindred spirits in that respect, and I think because I think I felt the same way as well. It took me a while to figure out. Wait, this is really a heart project for me. And it's because when you're teaching, whether it's your children, which I raised 4, or students in whatever, you often never ever get to see that impact.
Yeah.
And then you have this aha moment when you get some random email 8 years after you had somebody as your
No,
student.
exactly. Yeah,
And
exactly.
and because you get emotional talking
Yeah.
about it, that means it
Yeah.
means something to you. And that student sends you an email and says, I have to tell you what happened at work today. And this never would have happened had it not been for you. Or, because being a teacher isn't always just the technical stuff.
Right.
I don't know how many students I've counseled through a rough patch they're going through at the same time they're
Sure.
taking my class, or,
Yeah.
whatever. But then you get this kind of 2x4 upside the head that, wow, this is that person. I don't even remember who that person was.
But when you have 1,000 students over there, it's
Yeah.
hard to remember all.
It,
I remember their faces, the names, and the faces change, but the names not so much. But
yeah.
yeah,
And they're saying that this happened and it never would have happened had I not met you and you hadn't
yeah,
steered me this direction or you hadn't
right,
taught me this. And
right,
then you go, wow, that's a humbling moment
yeah,
to know that you made a difference in somebody's life. And the fact of
yeah.
the matter is, you're probably, all those 1,000 students, you've made a difference in 1,000 students' lives. And
Hopefully,
that
yeah,
care and feeding, they're probably also taking that and paying it forward. I call it the
yeah,
ripple effect.
yeah,
You make a
right,
difference that's notable to somebody, and then they want to make a difference.
right,
So I applaud that change that you're hoping you make in the world, because I feel the same way.
yeah.
Darin, thank you. This has been an absolute delight. Thank you so
Likewise.
much for
Thank
joining
you.
me. When you get these secret projects you can't tell me about quite yet, you don't have to wait for an
Well,
invitation. Just drop
okay,
me a note and say, hey,
sounds
Cherise, I got
good.
a good one for you and I'd love to have you back.
Sounds great. Thank you so much for having me. It's a true pleasure. Yeah, great conversation. Thank you.
Thank you. I appreciate it.